This morning we have Talise Zuber with iCard Merrill. She's going to talk about elections. We've got Dave Hawksbrun with a Kavanaugh and Company, and he's going to talk about budgets. We've got Scott Peterson with the firm of Scott Peterson, and he's going to be talking about records maintenance. And then to round it all out, Mary Hawk with Porges, Hamlin, Knowles and Hawk is going to talk about dispute resolution. So with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Talise.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate your attendance today. Most of you are probably here because you're required to be here. And congratulations for making the board of directors of your co-op or your condominium. But I think that you'll find that the information provided in the course overall is going to be very useful, just generally, if nothing else, for issue spotting. I understand that you do have a copy of the outline, and that can be made available if you don't have it from the CAI office. And at the end of the program, there will be a certificate that CAI will present, and I'll let Karen provide a little more information at the end of the presentation on that. We do have 4 topics today that we are required to hit for the certification. The first one is on elections. I do want to give you just a second of my background. I am an attorney, shareholder, and the president of the law firm of iCard Merrill. We've got offices in Sarasota and Lakewood Ranch, and I have been practicing in this area of law for 22 years, regularly teaching courses, working with associations generally after turnover, both the boards of directors and the association managers. So appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. And for all of those that I already know, hello to the clients and the managers that I work with. Appreciate you being here. So jumping right in for elections, where there's about 6 pages of our first outline. So my goal on this is to give you a general overview of how a statutory election process is to work. That doesn't mean that there aren't some discrepancies or different things that may be applicable just to your condo or co-op, but for the most part, this is how the statute holds election practices. And we're going to go through this so you at least understand what the statutory process is. My guess is that 98% of you follow the statutory election process, so it will be applicable to you. Co-ops are governed by Florida Statute 719. Condominiums are governed by Florida Statute 718, what we call the Condominium Act, and they are very similar in how they practice generally, and certainly in their elections. So both co-ops and condos are technically corporations. They are usually for residential. They don't have to be. We can have commercial condominiums. And you are not obligated, if you're in a commercial condominium, to go through this election process. So I just want to lay that out at the beginning, that there can be a different process for commercial condominiums. But otherwise, you're a corporation with either owners, investors, sometimes you call them members, you call them unit owners, whatever it is, it's the same concept. And so you've got a group of individuals in your condo or co-op. They get to participate in the process of electing the directors. There will always be an election every year. You're required to hold one annually, which will be within that calendar year. That may be different than your fiscal year, which doesn't have to be a calendar year. So you may have a budget meeting or something like that that's different. But for your every year, you need to have an election. There are things you need to look at in order to prepare, and we're going to talk about that first before the election and planning ahead. But there's a couple of resources for you to look at. Like I said, the first is your statutory provisions, which are applicable in 718 or 719, depending if you're a condo or a co-op. And when I say your association governing documents, most of what we'll be talking about today will be from your bylaws. Just a quick overview, your declaration of restrictions usually tells you the restrictions that are applicable to your particular condominium or co-op. Your articles set up your corporation, just like any corporation is set up and filed with the Department of Corporations for the state of Florida. And your bylaws tell you how to run that corporation. So we'll be talking a lot about what you would be finding in your bylaws if you're otherwise trying to find where you need to get this information from to ensure that what we talk about today is applicable to your community. So before the election, you need to start planning ahead. There's a 60-day notice requirement, a first notice that is required to go out to let everyone know, hey, our annual meeting's coming up. And the election must always be held with the annual meeting. So when you're planning and you say, okay, we're going to have our annual meeting on February 23rd today, you're going to have to count 60 days backwards just to make sure that you hit the notice. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this, just to make sure you hit that first notice requirement, which means you really need to start this discussion somewhere around 90 days in advance to be able to plan, figure out where the meeting will be, what documents you need, and so on. You're also going to need to ensure that you've got a roster of owners. One of the first things you have to do is send out a notice of that first notice of election. So the materials you have to gather would include your owner roster, who is a record owner, and sometimes it needs to be updated if you've had sales or transfers in the last year. And I'm going to, if you're looking at the outline, if your particular outline that you have discusses anything with HOA, I'm looking at one that does. We're not going to be discussing HOA today. We have parsed out this particular class for condo and co-ops, and HOA will be a separate class later. So I'll talk about some of the differences, but I just want to clarify, we're not talking about HOAs today. So if you're going through the outline, it will talk about nominating committee searches and HOA changes. That's not going to be applicable for today. We'll talk about determining election monitors. Usually it's the manager or the board of directors collectively trying to set the date for the annual meeting and figuring out when you're going to hold that. And then you have to figure out whether or not you're going to be using electronic voting. Electronic voting is allowed under both condo and co-op law. But you have to go through a series of steps, and this may mean that you need to consider this before 90 days, and almost for sure you would need to in order to hold an electronic voting election. You have to get voter consents. The association has to provide and make sure there's a method used to authenticate who is voting. You have to ensure that you've got the ability to have a secret ballot to separate, ensure everyone only votes once from actually how they vote. Yet at the same time, you have to be able to store all of that in order to ensure that you meet the official records requirements of holding these documents for 1 year, and to ensure that if there's a challenge within the first 60 days, that you've got all of the records and documents from the election to be able to do that. All of this can be done, by the way, and most associations that are doing this will use an outside resource for electronic voting. There's a few companies that do it, but the board alone could decide whether or not to have an electronic voting method by a board resolution, but that has to be done at least 14 days in advance. So a little bit of background and legwork before you get started. So we're ready, and we're going to have, let's assume we're going to have a regular election without electronic voting, in which we're mailing out our notices. And we'll talk a little bit about some different options from there, but we're going to go old school style and talk about how it will be if you are holding an election the way you may have held one 5 years ago. Make sure that you understand that process. So the first thing that goes out, as we discussed, is the 60-day first notice. It says, hey, we're going to have an annual meeting election. It's going to be at least 60 days in advance. And it's going to include an opportunity for anyone that qualifies to be a board member to submit notification to the association that, hey, I want to be a candidate for this election. Your first notice might include how many positions are available, whether it's 3 or 5. Sometimes it's 2 if you've got some staggered terms. And it will also have usually information on the qualification. If there's nothing in the governing documents that requires a specific qualification for a board member, such as you must be an owner or a spouse of an owner, or you have to have certain requirements met, then the law really only says you have to be 18 years of age and have a clean criminal record that's where you don't have an issue with the division or don't have any type of criminal record for the last 5 years where your rights have not been restored. So pretty vanilla standard for most board members for qualifications. So you send out this first notice, and it's essentially a notice to say, hey, we're going to have this. It's generally done by regular mail. You can email if someone has opted in for electronic notice to receive their notices. And it's going to include a date in there in that first notice of 40 days. If you want to be a candidate for election, you have to be able to respond within the 40th day, within 40 days before the election. So in other words, we've been counting back 60 days before the election, 40 days before the election, and these time periods are not negotiable. So, and I didn't do the work today to figure out what 60 days would have been before February 23rd, which is today's date. But if it were to land on a 60th day, were to land on a Sunday, then that notice has to be out at least by that Sunday. How does that happen? We don't have mail on Sunday. Well, that means it would have to have gone out before that. Same thing concept with your eligible candidates getting their notice in 40 days in advance. And it can be handed in any way that ensures that it's there on time. It can be faxed, it can be emailed, it can be hand delivered, it can be left under the door and so on. But the burden is on the person being the candidate to ensure that it got there within the 40th day. What does that mean? Well, if you're getting ready to hand deliver a notice to say, I'm going to hand this in, I want to be a candidate, and that office is closed at 5 p.m., then there's not a method for hand delivery unless you're there by 5. So you might have to fax it. That doesn't mean the 40th day cuts off at 5, but it may mean that you have to fax it, email it, or some other way that verifies that it happened on that particular date. There's also an opportunity within 35 days before the election for a candidate information sheet. This is essentially what we call a resume or CV. It can only be one side of one sheet. It cannot be altered by the association. It has to be sent out in advance. So some of the questions I see sometimes are, there was some information in the candidate information sheet that the association doesn't believe is accurate, or some posturing by a candidate. The association doesn't have the authority to make a change to the candidate information sheet, but cannot mail it out if it is received less than 35 days prior to the election, and cannot mail it out if it doesn't meet the requirements of one side of one page of an 8.5 by 11. There's a case on point, which was fairly interesting. One side, it was English. The second side was in Spanish. Of course, this came out of the Miami-Dade area, and that did not meet the requirements under the administrative code that it's one side, one sheet. If there's no candidate information sheet, no big deal. You don't have to have one. You just have to do the notice of intent to run. So now you've hit your 60-day first notice. You've got 40 days. You've got all the people that want to be a candidate 40 days in advance. You've got that list. They've sent in their notice 35 days before. You've got the cutoff of the candidate information sheet. Now what do we do? Somewhere between the 14th day and the 34th day, 35 days was your deadline for the candidate information sheet. So starting with day 34, you can send out the second notice of election. That will include the agenda for the annual meeting. There may be some other things you want to talk about besides the election. It will be the election material, which will be a pre-printed ballot with the names, surname order for those that have indicated that they want to be a candidate in advance. Those ballots are included with what we call an outer envelope and an inner envelope. In order to have a secret ballot, the ballot will not have a place for name to be signed. And that ballot, that election ballot, will go into an inner envelope, which just usually says election ballot, but then that inner envelope will be placed in an outer envelope. The outer envelope is key. The outer envelope requires your name, your address, your unit number, and a signature. The most key point on this is if it's not signed on the outside of the envelope, it is not valid. It is disregarded by the association. So if you forgot your unit number, didn't put the address, that may or may not be critical if they can identify who the owner is. But if you don't sign it, then that doesn't count. So make sure that you follow the instructions or have instructions if you're sending out notice of election to the owner so they understand these little tiny, what we would call details, which makes all the difference in the world. You can opt out of this process entirely And I'll just say this as a side, and even though we're in the middle of the process, you can't opt out. It would need to be an amendment to your bylaws. It does have to be approved by at least a majority of the total voting interests, and a vote of the membership. However, I will say in general, most associations don't opt out of this process other than to use electronic voting. But if this sounds a little daunting and a lot of details, it is possible to opt out. With your election process, you will also have a proof of notice affidavit ensuring that you have met all the deadlines, the 60, the 40, the 35 day, and most importantly, that 14 day saying we sent out the second notice of the annual meeting and election. The proof of notice affidavit is generally signed by the person mailing out the second notice. That may not be anyone on the board of directors or a manager. It may even be that it is the person in the office, but is the person with the knowledge to be able to confirm we did send out the notices in a timely manner. When the candidate intention sheets come in or their candidate information sheets come in, you will generally want to make sure that you as an association have timed or date stamped them so that you know when you receive them. There's lots and lots of cases disputing whether or not someone has received them timely. You do have to think about this in advance. Again, as I said, if your office is closed on a Sunday, which most of them would be, whether it's the association office or the management office, that means you're not going to be able to accept personal delivery of the information sheets or the candidate intent to run. But you can verify if they came in on a Sunday, usually by email or fax or some other method. So just be aware that you're going to need to keep track of that. But the burden is on the owner or on the person wanting to be the candidate to prove that they did submit it in time. So now we get to the meeting. So when the meeting is being held, and this is a bit old school, and I'll touch base a little bit on how to do it by Zoom as well, because I think that's the reality of where a lot of associations are going. You'll do a sign-in. Usually we just use an owner roster and have them sign next to their name. There may be proxies also that sign, but everybody's signing in. If you're doing it by Zoom or mixed media, you should have a list of individuals or people that are on the Zoom so you can verify who is there, because you do have to hit a quorum requirement. The quorum requirement will be whatever the bylaws say. It can be as low, I've seen, of 25 or 30%. The average is usually what they call 51% or majority. It just depends on what your bylaws say. Sometimes it's lower. But in order to hold the annual meeting, you need to obtain a quorum. But that is different than what you need for holding the election. You only need 20% of the individuals in your condo or co-op to have responded to the election process in order to hold the election. In other words, if you've got 100 units in a condo, as long as you have 20 election ballots that have been turned in, you can hold the election. But it may be, if your quorum is a majority, that you're not able to hold the annual meeting and conduct the rest of the business or vote on other issues that come up at the annual meeting. But you can conduct the election. I want to clarify at this point that there is no ability in condominium law to have what we call an election committee or nominating committee, where you're drumming up interest or business to try to get people to run for the board. That is not authorized. The other thing that's not authorized is the association cannot send out any sheet or statement or make any recommendations towards any candidate. That has to be fully neutral from the association. When the election materials come in to the association, either at the meeting after people have signed in and they're turning in their election ballots, or if they've mailed them in advance, make sure that those envelopes are not opened. They cannot be opened in advance unless you appoint what we call an election committee that would be able to verify the outer envelopes. There is a process for that, but the board of directors must appoint the election committee in advance. It needs to be at an open meeting. And then that committee would be needing to meet on the same day of the annual meeting, have it noticed, where they verify who has signed the outer envelopes and make sure that unit 1 is only voted once, and that unit 1, owned by Tom Brown, is the one that signed the outer envelope. That is a potential. You are authorized to do that, but there are notice requirements, just the same as if you were going to hold a board meeting, to be able to do that. Those committee members can't be someone running for the board. It can't be a current board member, a spouse, and no officers of the board of directors or their spouses. It has to be totally unrelated. And that meeting must be open to the owners. The owners have the right to see the entire process for transparency. If we're going to talk about the election at the annual meeting, which we're getting ready to start into now, we'll talk about how the counting and the verification, even of the outer envelopes, has to be done within the presence of the owners. And I don't mean the presence in the other room where you can't see them. It has to be within the same room so that you can have everyone available to see the process and make sure that it is fully transparent. So let's talk about what the annual meeting will look like. Normally, you would say call to order, ensure that you have an opening time and start for your minutes of your meeting. And normally right away, you're going to say, this is your last call for election ballots. If you have a ballot and you're just coming in, you need to get this to us now. Then you're going to do a closing of that. And then they're going to verify that you've got at least 20% of those election ballots turned in so that you can even hold the election. At this point, the committee that is doing this needs to be, as I said, in the same room. Normally it's at a table in the back. If you're doing Zoom, it is possible to do it this way, and we won't talk about what you had to do to make sure that you are authorized to hold a meeting for the owners via Zoom. That's a little bit of a different topic, but let's assume you've gone through the board resolutions or amendments to the bylaws to get there. You can do this where the committee is on one frame of a Zoom at a meeting. So you can see behind me, I've got a table. If I had a committee of, say, 4 people back there looking at ballots and tabulating ballots and going through the list of owners to ensure everyone only voted once, and you can see it in the Zoom frame, it is my position that that will meet the open notice requirements. But at this point, let's talk mostly about an in-person meeting, which is a little bit easier because there are some variations and some factors beyond that you have to think about when you're doing Zoom. So the election committee is looking at the outer envelope, making sure at this point that once the election polls are closed and you say we're not taking any more, you cannot take any more election ballots. What is in, once you've started to open the outer envelopes, that is all that's entitled to be taken. So if somebody comes in 20 minutes late, and at this point, the individuals on the committee are taking the inner envelopes, the secret ballot envelope, out of the outer envelopes, the person that comes in 20 minutes late cannot submit their ballot. The proper process for opening the envelopes would be to open that first envelope, the outer envelope, put the inner envelope to the side, and once all of the outer envelopes are done, you must keep those for the official records, and then your inner envelopes, you can open them, and that's how to become a true secret ballot. You have to keep track of everything. All of the envelopes have to be kept. All the ballots have to be kept. While this part is happening, with the election being the first part of the agenda, you can proceed with the rest of the agenda for the annual meeting, whatever else that may be. Sometimes it's discussion of how the year went. Sometimes there's votes on other things, but you can proceed for the remainder of the annual meeting. At the end of the annual meeting, or whenever the balloting and counting is done, then you would announce the results of the election. At that point, you might have a tie. That sometimes happens. Review your bylaws to see what process you are to follow if there's a tie. Most of the bylaws will say something along the lines of flip a coin, draw a straw, something of that sort, but you can do a runoff election, and the statute does authorize for that, where those 2 people that are tied or 3 people that are tied would be the only ones in the election for that particular seat on the board of directors. It is possible, but if the candidates can agree amongst themselves, hey, I'll be on it this year and I'll just run again next year, then that's fine as well. That will conclude, for the most part, the annual meeting. Usually after the annual meeting, you hold a board of directors meeting, in which the key point there is to have an election of the officers. Officers are your president, secretary, vice president, and treasurer. You need to look at your governing documents. A lot of times it will say the president cannot also be the treasurer, or vice versa, or some things like that. And of course, if you only have 3 members of your board of directors and your officers all have to be board members, it may be that the secretary treasurer is one person and that holds both. You also generally want to discuss who's going to be a check signer. And generally, of course, that would be the treasurer, but you may want also the president to ensure that you've got 2 people signing checks. I know, a little archaic still, but generally associations still have checks as well. So then the new board, so congratulations, you made it to the board, and you're doing exactly what you're doing today. You're going to do one of 2 things. You're either going to sign a certification form which says, I have read and understand and will uphold the governing documents to the best of my ability, or you're going to attend an educational seminar like the one today. If you're going to do either one, it has to be done within 90 days. The statute says that you've deemed to have given up your position if you don't. So you need to ensure that you're meeting the requirements. And then once you've taken a course, as long as you continue on the board of directors without an interruption from term to term. So if you've got 1-year terms, if you stay on for 5 years, then there's no problem where you don't have to take another certification course like this. You are deemed to have been able to continue on with this certification for the duration of your term, as long as it is continuous. I do want to point out that your documents that you have from the annual meeting and election have to be kept for 1 year under the official records requirements under the statute, and that if something went awry or a bit irregular, you are in the clear after day 61. There's only 60 days to challenge an election. So if you haven't heard from someone, but you're unsure if you did something correct, that sometimes got a little bit iffy, once 60 days has passed, the door is closed to challenge an election. Karen, I'm going to see if there's a couple questions here.
There are a couple questions here. It starts with Alan McKenzie has a question. We have had 2 officers whose 3-year terms are up. They both agreed to run again. There were no other people willing to run for the office. So it was stated that there will not have an election. Is this correct? The 2
Yes.
prior board of directors will be sworn in as directors before the officer elections at the board of director portion of the annual meeting.
Yeah, let's talk about that real quick. So you have to send out that 60-day notice. Notice of intent to be a candidate has to be in within 40 days. Once that 40th day hits and you get to day 39 and we had 3 positions and 3 people, then that means there is no election. So that is correct on the question that there would not be an election for that particular association. I do want to point out there is a difference between a board member and an officer. And I usually try to use the terms officers only for those president, vice president, and so on, which is different than your director. Your directors are elected by the members. Your officers are elected by the directors, not the members. So there is a difference there. There's also another question. We have some special voting amendments this year, discussion rules and regs. Then we receive final ballots. If it's final election ballots, the answer is no, that is not okay. The election portion of the meeting has to be the first order of business. When I prepare a meeting package, it generally says, call to order, and then call for election ballots, closing of the polls, determination of the 20%, and then it will say determination of a quorum to figure out if you can even hold the rest of the meeting. If your election part is not done first, it's not done accurately. If you're talking final ballots for other things, such as discussion of rules and regulations or voting on amendments, that can happen later. So after I do the quorum requirement, which might be a majority. Then it will be reports of officers, committees, and so on, might be a vote on amendments. And so that would be fine, but not the election. The election has to be first. Do I have 2 more minutes? I can run through these real quick.
Yeah, we'll take a couple more questions here. Can you vote for board members by proxy?
No, you have to do this specific dual envelope process or electronic voting without a proxy, unless you have opted out of the election process, like we said.
And then is there an official form from the state of Florida to certify reading the documents? Yes.
Yes, there is. Cumulative voting, which is the next question, is however many you get. It doesn't mean you have to get a majority of the votes in order to get on the board. It just means whoever got the highest number of votes. Election of officers is open to the members in that it is the board meeting is open to the members, but the officers are elected by the board of directors. That may be all I have time for.
Yeah.
What if you want to enlarge the board? That is an issue with looking at your bylaws and what the vote requirement is for enlarging that board of directors. It's not, hey, we have 5 people that want to be on the 3-man board this year, so we're just going to determine that it's a 5-person board. There's usually a process and maybe an amendment. So maybe all I have time for, so I'm not getting into David's presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Talise. I appreciate it a lot.
Give her the hook. Give her the hook.
I'm sorry, what, Dave?
Give her the hook.
It's the attorney. Get the attorney on the screen.
You get them started and they won't stop.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Turn it over to you, Dave.
All righty. Thanks. And thank you everyone for being here today. Really appreciate your participation. Little background on me and my firm. I'm with Cavanaugh Company. We have office in Sarasota and Venice. Started my career actually in St. Pete in '84 and I was thrown into an association way back then, Condo Association on Isla del Sol. And I was brought down here to work on banks and audit banks. But once I got into the condominium association industry, I just fell in love with it and have continued to practice that to this day. I worked through the leadership of Suncoast Chapter of CAI, started my career up in St. Pete, and then I'm also our CPAs have the Florida Institute of Certified Public Accountants. That's kind of our trade association, and we form committees for various functions within that group. We have a CIRA committee, which is Common Interest Realty Association, which covers condos, HOAs, co-ops, and timeshares. And that's a committee that was formed in the mid-'80s to just raise the level of competence within the CPA profession in terms of serving CPAs, serving associations, and I've been on that since its inception. Also has a legislative arm or legislative subcommittee, and I've been a member of that also. And I'll circle back to that in a little bit. Because there's a lot of things going on now that I will go off script for, but just to give you a heads up, I'm not going to give you any specific direction on things, but just to give you a heads up on some of the things that are coming down the road. You do have the outline. It's a pretty darn good outline and narrative, and I'm going to read every single word verbatim, and then that'll be real exciting. I'm not. I'm just going to kind of go over some of the highlights. Like I said, it's a good narrative, a lot of good points in here. And just starting with what is a budget, and I've always said that the budget is absolutely the cornerstone of the association's financial existence. It's the first thing that should be thought of and starting. And I'll talk about a lot of that in the flow of information and the flow of transactions later. When to begin the budget process? This says 3 to 5 months before. That is fine in terms of the general operating budget, but I'm telling you, if you plan on getting a reserve study and using that as part of your budget, you better get on board pretty quick. I was just meeting with an association 2 days ago that wanted to get an updated reserve study, and they reached out to their reserve folks, and they're booked out until September. So I think there's a lot of focus now, especially with some of the things that happened with Surfside on reserves. And again, I'll circle back and talk about that. But operating side, 3 to 5 months is fine. Reserves, I would take a look at that sooner than later. Just the general format of the operating fund or the budget. There's generally two sections. Operating fund, as it says, it deals with the day-to-day operations of the association. And one of the things I always preach to my associations too is that the budget is just a tool. It's not the law. It's not the limits to which you can make expenditures. It's just a tool to guide the association in their forward financial transactions. So if there's a particular line item that you may have to exceed, you exceed it. And don't try to fudge the numbers to make it work and make everything under or at budget, because that does no one any good in the next go around when you're trying to come up with the following year's budget. The table at the bottom, some interesting points there. The budget is divided into two sections: operating reserve. We'll talk about reserves later. Money in the operating section is not restricted for any particular purpose. That's true. You know, operating funds are there for management and board's discretion. Unit owners must approve using reserves for other purposes. That is true. It's a majority of those present at a duly called meeting. That's for alternate use of reserves as well as waiving reserves. And we'll get to that a little later too. Operating reserve funds can't be commingled unless for investment purposes. That is in, I believe it's in the rules, if not the statute. But we've seen in practice that's the reality of that is pretty loose in terms of, you know, being strict about where the monies are actually invested. And I get a lot of questions about, should each separate reserve have a separate related bank account? Absolutely not. There's no reason to tie your monies that way. And the budget should be for your, you know, your fiscal or calendar year. Next page, when there's something to think about, when you're thinking about the budget and the budget format and how, well, one of the main reasons of the budget is to determine what assessments are going to be charged to the members, to the unit owners. And there are some options on how expenditures can be paid for in the upcoming year. And you may want to consult with your CPA or tax advisor, because there may be some strategies involved with how things are placed in the budget to protect them from possible income tax. We've got some associations that have significant rental operations and actually antenna rental. Those two activities are, for the most part, and I'm going to say 100%, taxable activities. And there are ways to place those items in the budget to make to more or less protect them or get you in a better tax position. So if you have that type of thing, may want to get with your tax advisor or your CPA. It says here that the budget must provide sufficient funds to be collected in advance to pay for expenses. One of the things that always comes up in questions about this is insurance premiums. And again, I'll circle back to that in a minute, but insurance premiums are out of control right now. And they were before. It's a large nut to pay for. Oftentimes, or we've seen it at the beginning of the year, always get the question of, well, can I borrow from my reserves to pay for the premium and pay it back over the period of time so that by the end of the year, everything is back to normal? The technical answer to that is no, you can't do that unless you get a member vote. As I said before, alternate use of reserve funds requires a member vote. But that's where the cyclical nature of a budget and your activities needs to be analyzed in your budget process. You may need more of a cushion at the beginning of the year, more cash available at the beginning of the year than at the end for those premiums. And another thing too is when you divide your budget up, if you're getting regular reporting monthly or quarterly, that those budget numbers may not, the accurate way to report those may not be just dividing by 12, because you may have more landscaping in the summer or something that's a little more up and down throughout the year. So don't just think that you have to take your total number and divide by 12 and that's your monthly budget, if you will. Preparing the budget. Look to the past, of course. Yeah, that's one of the best indicators on what you can do and what you can expect for the upcoming years. It says 2 to 3 years worth of historical information. Yeah, that's good. I don't see 3 years, maybe 2. One historical year projected to where you're going to be in the current year, and then some indicator there. Look to the future. Yeah. The other thing too is go ahead and reach out to your significant service providers and maybe get contracts in place so you have an absolute certainty with respect to, say, landscaping services or whatever it may be. Your cable, that's another thing that may be pretty certain. And again, the look at expenses on a month-by-month basis, that's what I mentioned before, maybe a little more cyclical throughout the year, peaks and valleys. The last item here of involving community sounds good in practice, but I think you have to do that at your own risk. I'm sure you can get some wild ideas from your community about what they see as the right place to spend your money. So the budget format, there are some very specific requirements under Florida law for the format of the budget. What I'll say before any of that, though, and this is another thing that I preach all day long with my clients, is there needs to be continuity between all of the pieces that you're putting together into that budget and the end result of your year-end financial reporting. And that goes from the reserve study, your reserve budget, your operating budget, your chart of accounts, your regular internal accounting or monthly accounting done by internal or management company, and then resulting in your year-end financial reporting that may be done by a CPA. There needs to be a link between all of those numbers. When we start talking about what goes into a reserve budget, those same groupings and those same categories should be mirrored into your budget and then into your financial records, which would then make the year-end financial reporting seamless. And it just answers so many more questions before they're asked. You don't have to ask, where are these numbers coming from? It should be all consistent throughout the process. And I've had to work with many associations for many years to get that process in line. It just may not happen overnight. But again, and these are requirements under Florida law. All estimated common expenses need to be listed. Estimated total expenses on a monthly basis, the beginning and ending periods covered by the budget, and that's a gotcha. And they said later in this some budget errors. I've known associations where they list the 2021 or 22 budget for the year ended December 31, 21 or December 31, 22. That doesn't comply with statute, and they've been dinged by the division for not having the beginning and ending dates. And as it says here, January 1 through December 19, December 31st. So technically that is supposed to be on that budget. There are requirements, these items listed of expenditures, administration, management fees, maintenance, on and on. Those are required. If they're not applicable, then you can mark them NA. Calculating assessments, that's normally in your documents in terms of how assessments are to be allocated among unit owners. A lot of times square footage, type of unit, per unit. Once you get into limited common elements, special facilities that you may have, there's going to be separate calculations for those. So you just have to refer to your documents on that. At the very bottom of the page, this is an important note to make, and this gets misinterpreted a lot also, states that it's important to note when the board adopts a budget that exceeds 100%, 115% of the prior year's assessments, the statutes state that 10% of the voting interests are entitled to petition the board to have a special meeting. What's missing from that statement, though, is that included or not included in the 115% as you're looking at it are reserves and any expense that the board feels is not going to be recurring. So that is directly from the statute. So keep that in mind as you're considering that 115%. Next page, recommendations for the operating budget. This says due to current economic condition. I think that this was written a few years ago. Record number of foreclosures. I'm not seeing that much in terms of foreclosures these days. The tough, like I said before, the tough one to handle now is insurance. It's just skyrocketing, and we're seeing associations having to actually special assess after the fact to cover the insurance. So again, go back to, can I borrow from reserves? Technically, no. But you know, you do need to get a grip on your insurance, and that's another reason for starting this process early. This goes on to talk about bad debt also, and you know, if you do have foreclosures and bad debt, and you're not anticipating collecting of 100% of the assessments, just please keep in mind, as we get into reserves later, I mentioned this, but reserves need to be fully funded, regardless of how much is actually being collected. So even if you're only collecting $9 out of 10, 100% of the reserves need to be funded. So you can't catch a break there. You have to fully fund reserves as budgeted. Last it's kind of a paragraph where it starts condominium association. This is an error in this presentation. It says there, condominiums are no longer able to waive financial reporting requirements. That's incorrect. They actually can waive financial reporting requirements indefinitely, and that goes for co-ops too. So that's a change in this handout, and it just talks about making sure that you budgeted for the proper amount for your financial reporting preparation. So reserves, and this is probably the most significant area of concern these days, especially with budgets. We'll have some general discussion in this about reserves, and then some very specific about the options in terms of straight line or pooling method. And what are reserves? There's specific expenditures will be incurred in the future, relate to the cost of major repairs or replacements. And you'll hear me flip between reserves and replacement fund, reserve fund or replacement fund. So those terms are almost interchangeable as we go through. And these are so important in terms of the Florida legislature and their view on it, that there are so many required disclosures in your budget, as well as your financial statements relative to reserves. In addition to that, and I'll just hit on financial reporting a bit, there are national standards in terms of financial reporting that require information on reserves. So it's pretty beefy what you need in your budget, as well as your year-end financial statements in terms of reserves, disclosures, descriptions, and things like that. And that's one area we focus a lot on in helping our associations, is really honing in on what their approach to the reserves, how they're informing members about funding requirements, what's required to be funded, and we'll see some more coming down the road too. Get to that in a minute. Yeah, and they also say, again, it's mostly long-term repair and replacement. We do see other types of reserves, and you can establish a reserve for anything. Mentioned here a flood and 3-year flood, but we've actually seen associations establish reserves for their windstorm, their regular insurance, and maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they'll put that into reserve just so they do have those funds available. So again, just something to think about. Caveat to all of this, and you just need to keep your eyes and ears open for what's coming down the pike, because right now legislature's meeting and there's several bills going through that are dealing with reserves for condominium and co-ops. We've reviewed several of them already, and some of them have teeth, and some of them will come true. We're commenting on them as they go. But there's just discussion about mandatory reserves, no waiving, required reserve studies, no pooling could be used. But again, these are all on the table to be batted around Tallahassee for a while. But just keep your eyes and ears open for any changes there, and through CAI, of course, and your attorney and your CPA, just keep asking about that if you could. So Having said that, let's talk about the way it is now, the different types of reserves. Standard, these are standard and required by law: roof, paving, painting. Any other item of $10,000 or more. Question always comes up on $10,000, and we've had this discussion with division over the years. Well, what does that mean? If I've got 3 pools with pool pumps of $5,000 each, is that one item of $15,000, or is it separate items of $5,000 each? And again, I believe it's in the rules, the division has said that's a judgment call that any association can make. So it's really up to you to make that call. And again, you can establish a reserve for anything else that you choose, but it has to have a specific purpose. And once again, it's established, it needs to be used for that purpose. They talk about contingency reserves here. We used to have that years and years ago. State didn't like that, so they got rid of that term. Won't allow it in reserve schedules. If you choose to have that, it should be in your operating fund. I think I said before that one of the options, once you've got your budget in place and with reserves, and an option that associations currently have is that they can waive or choose less than fully funded amounts. Again, I haven't mentioned it yet, but the proposed annual budget must include reserves at a fully funded level. But the association does have the option of putting to membership either waiving reserves or less than full funding of reserves. And that is a member vote. Again, a majority of members at duly called meeting. And the only recommendation or comment I'll have here is that if you do choose that path, and a lot of times the boards get a sense of what the membership are willing to pay, and they may choose a less than fully funded amount. Give them only 2 options, full funded or the other. If you end up with more than that, you may not get the result you want with a less than fully funded if one doesn't get the majority of those votes. So only give them 2 options. Estimating reserves. Again, this is where the reserve study comes in, and strongly, we CPAs, we strongly encourage associations to get a formal third-party reserve study done by a professional. They're the pros at it, and they should be the pros at it. And one thing I will say about that is, if you do get a reserve study, just work with your reserve study provider and have discussions with them and challenge them on the way things are being done. They may have a different vision of the way things are being repaired or replaced in your community. Again, that's just really important, but it doesn't prohibit, the statutes currently do not prohibit the association from developing their own reserve schedules and reserve study. And what should they have on there? It just should have all of the items that are required to be provided for. A lot of times I say you don't know what you need to provide for in terms of reserves until it breaks. And that does happen a lot. Seawalls we didn't see for a long time, pond restoration we didn't see for a long time. And I think there's going to be more coming down the road too, in terms of legislation that you may need to consider for reserves. Again, there's specific requirements under Florida law for the schedule on straight line component. And this is where we'll get into straight line versus pooling. Straight line component just means you list every one of those components, and a portion of your reserve fund balance is allocated to each of those components. And you calculate what the required funding is for each of those components based on a specific formula. And very simply, it's replacement cost minus existing fund balance or projected fund balance toward the end of the year. That net result divided by the remaining life of that component is its fully funded amount for the next year. Very simple calculation, very easy to deal with. Again, there are specific requirements for that. I want to just stress again that you do have to have that on a fully funded basis. But one of the things too, and I kind of alluded to it before, this is a living, breathing process too. Sometimes you don't know what you're going to have to reserve for until it breaks. Sometimes you no longer have things that need to be replaced. Sometimes associations, especially co-ops, they'll buy things and they put things on the books. Well, now you have to provide reserves. If it's over $10,000, you have to provide reserves for it. So think about things that you're actually expending, new projects or things like that. Another thing to consider when putting these schedules together in terms of replacement, there are many types of reserve items that aren't done at a single time. And some of the reserve folks don't always understand that. I had an association that had docks, a significant amount of docks. And the reserve folks said, okay, you're going to replace your docks all at once in 1 year. And it was physically impossible for them to do that, to replace the docks. So that's where I go back to saying, challenge the reserve study. Another thing to do is with sewers, streets, they may be done in phases. You can break those down into your budgets. And very quickly, before I run out of time, I want to mention pooling. It's a good option right now. Anytime you go into that process or into that method, it is 9 times out of 10, 99% of the time, going to reduce your overall assessments. Required for pooling, the items have to have a determinable life. So items like an insurance deductible can't be there. You can adopt pooling method. Board can adopt it and go forward with existing components remaining. You can have a member vote to take all of the component funds and put it into the pool and then go forward in total. So I think I'm about out of time.
You have a few questions, Dave. The first one is, do I understand you that in all reserves have to be approved by the shareholders?
No, all reserves, the board can establish a budget with reserves, and the membership has no say in that. So no, the board can establish the reserves. Okay.
Does Florida statute specify required owner votes to change a reserve account? We are proposing combining 2 reserve accounts into one.
Yeah.
For alarm and fire sprinkler into fire safety.
Technically, yes, that does have to be done by member vote. Because again, that's an alternate use of funds.
Can you increase the minimum reserves by vote of the board? This is add funds to the reserves minimum.
Yeah, again, the reserve study and the budget are up to the board to read and interpret. And right now, again, and the statute may change with this coming session. Right now, the reserve study is a tool. You can vary from that as long as you have a good reason to. And let's say you just think the reserve study is too low on something. Yeah, the board can increase that amount and increase reserves into the budget.
Do you have any information on ponds, retention ponds? Are there laws, statutes on requirements for maintaining them? They need to cost solitude.
Well, again, the dollar amount is important. If it's over $10,000 to maintain that. And like I said, we never saw pond retention issues before in reserves. And all of a sudden we're seeing some of those.
Okay. Must budget proposals be sent to unit owners ahead of approval by the board?
I believe I'm pretty sure that the budget does need to go to membership before it's voted on.
Okay, and the last question is, well, this is a cumulative voting question. So that was for Talise. So we can't answer that. Okay. Do you recommend an audit even though not mandated? If so, how often?
Oh yeah, no, of course we'll recommend audit. No.
You're an auditor. Of course you do.
And call me yet.
It's funny that was in the law where you could not waive it more than 3 years, the year-end financial reporting requirement, and whether it's compilation, review, or audit. I do strongly suggest that something get done and looked at by a third party. I think the cost isn't that great to do it occasionally, if not every year. We have many associations that have have these things done every year. And it's a feel-good thing, and it gives assurance to the membership.
With that being said, Dave, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And that concludes the financial portion, and we're going to go into records maintenance with Scott Peterson.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you, David. That was very well done and very informative. Official records, let's talk about that for a little bit. The first thing I'd like to say is this is an area in which the board can get itself into some trouble unless it's addressed. Requests to inspect official records are addressed in an organized manner. I'll go into that a little more, but the reason why I bring that up is I am a litigator by origin as an attorney. I started as a litigation attorney solely. I do most of my work now advising boards on day-to-day operations. But I do tend to look at things with an eye towards how things will play out in court and trying to advise clients on how to arrange their affairs so that it doesn't end up in court. And this is an area in which I think boards have to pay attention, managers have to pay attention, because it's something that you can easily find yourself in getting in trouble with. But if you follow the statutes and you're organized, there is no reason that it should get to that point. Owners have certain ideas about official records and about what the association's obligations are that are not quite in line with what the statutory obligations are. So I will go through the statutory obligations. We'll talk about that for a little bit. I'll talk about at the end of the going through some of this stuff, I'll talk about some practical methods that your association can use to address official records requests, and talk about the abuses of official records requests by some owners, which tends to cause problems. But let's talk about what official records are, first of all. There is a definition in both 718 and 719 of what official records are. And most of this is not very surprising. I'm not going to go down the list in extensive detail, but you should have some idea of what the official records are. There are some records that have to be permanently maintained by your association. For example, and this is not surprising, a copy of your plans, your warranties, things provided by the developer, a copy of your recorded governing documents, including the declaration, the bylaws, the articles, a copy of your rules, the minute book from your meetings, obviously. All those have to be permanently maintained. Most of the rest of your official records will have to be retained for a maximum of 7 years. There are a couple exceptions to that, which I'll go through in a minute. But keep that 7-year date in mind. In these days of digital scanning and storing, it is much cheaper to retain your official records than it used to be. It used to be we had to take bankers' boxes full of paper and pay to have them stored. And so it made sense to cull out your official records after 7 years and have an official policy aimed at that. While that's not quite as important anymore, I'll talk about what you want to do with an official retention and destruction policy. But just know right now, for our purposes, there are some records that you have to keep for at least 7 years. The current roster has to be maintained, the current insurance policies, the current management agreement. And I'd just like to highlight that for a minute. The management agreement, if you have an outside management firm, that is an official record of the association. There is a category of official records involving personnel who are direct employees hired by the association, not an independent contractor like a management company. But if you have an in-house manager or you have in-house maintenance people or that sort of thing, those are referred to as personnel records. Those are treated a little different, but just know the management agreement itself with your manager is considered an official record. Any bills of sale for any property owned by the association, your accounting records, of course, Here's one exception to the 7-year mark. The ballots, the sign-in sheets, the voting proxies, and all of your paperwork related to voting by unit owners, you have to retain for 1 year only. Obviously, with each election, you're going to have more of this stuff. But for that current election, you just got to retain it for the calendar year. If your association acts as a rental management and does its own rentals, you have to keep all those records. A copy of your current Q&A sheet, you have to keep that. There is a category under the law that says, to the effect, all other records of the association related to the operation of the association. It's what we call the catch-all category. This can cause all kinds of problems down the road for your association if you get into a conflict with an owner about official records, because there is this catch-all category. So it very helpful, the statute lists 15 or 16 different items, but then it includes this, anything you rely on in your business. So what are we talking about? Obviously, contracts you have with other vendors, invoices, anything your association refers to, your association manager refers to on a daily basis or keeps a record of, those things are considered official records, and you've got to maintain them just like you do the other categories. A question comes up often about recordings. Some management companies I know make audio recordings or video recordings of meetings of the board, meetings of members, and they use those in preparing the minutes so they don't forget anything or miss anything. If the association retains those recordings for use at a later date for any reason, beyond just preparing the minutes, those are considered official records. And if you maintain them, they fall in that catch-all category, and you've got to provide them. If the association manager just keeps them for the purposes of writing up the minutes and then destroys them, then they are not considered an official record. But I have to say, a lot of the things I'm going to say here are subject to interpretation. If there is a dispute, you go up to Tallahassee to the Division of Condominiums, and if you go through the arbitration process, the Division of Condominiums has issued decisions in a number of cases over the years about official records. And while those decisions are not binding on you if you go to court, they are sort of binding in the association context. So if there are questions on official records and you're not sure what you should keep, what you should discard, that sort of thing, this is definitely an area to review with your association attorney before you go about destroying anything that might be considered an official record. You do not want to be in the position as an association of destroying records willy-nilly without reviewing that very carefully with your attorney first, because you can get into trouble, and we'll talk about that down the road here. The cooperatives, I'll run through that real quick. I know we don't have a lot of cooperatives in the area, but we have some. Under 719, again, these are not going to be considered very controversial. Plans, permits, warranties provided by the developer, those are official records. Your cooperative documents, your current rules, the meeting minutes, that's got to keep those for 7 years. Current roster, your insurance policies, all that should sound very familiar. It's very similar to the condominium statute. Your financial records, of course. It has the same, in 719 has the same 1 year category for anything related to voting. So all of that is very, very similar to condominiums. And you should definitely, if you're in a cooperative, you should refer to 719 and go through that list carefully, but it's not going to be anything terribly different than what we covered already. A big question in official records concerns emails. And this, I want to put in my litigator hat for a minute and talk to you about this, because if you get into a dispute as an association with an owner, the very first thing they're going to go after is your email correspondence. They're going to want to see everything, if they're savvy or they get on the internet, They're going to demand to see your emails as an official record. So the question always comes up, are emails of the association board and the manager, are those official records? There have been some decisions by the division up in Tallahassee that says yes in some cases and no in others. And this is not, it's again, not written law, so it's not in court, but courts do tend to rely on the decisions of the association, even though they are not mandatory authority for the court. The general rule is if an association, if an email is sent to or from an association-owned computer, that is considered an official record. If it is sent, there's a recent decision, and I think it was decided maybe June or January 2020, that talked about what happens if your association manager is copied on an email. Is that considered an official record? That case did consider it an official record. The one carve out here is if you have emails from private board members to other private board members about association business that are kept only on their association, on their personal computers, not the association owned computer, and not copied to the manager, are those considered official records? And thus far, the decisions from Tallahassee have been they are not. So again, emails between board members, private emails on their private computers that don't include the manager or are not sent to an association-owned computer, those are not considered official records. So that's a little confusing. What I usually recommend to folks is if you're a board member and you're sending emails back and forth, number one, don't use your regular private email address that you use for everything else. Go to Gmail or some other email service provider that provides you a free email address. And for your association, whatever it is, the Happy Trails Condo Association, just create a new email address, Pres Happy Trails or whatever you want, and use that email address for all your association related activity. Number one, it will be helpful if there is litigation, hopefully not, but if there is litigation somewhere down the road, you will have all of your emails related to the association in one place, and you won't have to go scrubbing through your own personal emails to do that. Number two, it will help you keep track of association related activity, which will be useful in running your association. But also keep in mind that whenever you send an email that's copied to the manager, you have the potential of that email being released to an owner. Do you want that? And do you want that owner to have your personal email address? These are all things you might want to consider. So I typically advise clients to set up a separate email address to handle those situations. But again, this email business gets a little confusing. But if you're a board member sending emails to other board members on your private computers, those are generally not considered official records of the association. If it goes to an association-owned computer or goes to the manager, those are considered official records. If you get into a lawsuit, however, I will tell you that even if it's a board member to board member email, it's likely that opposing counsel will subpoena it or will request it in discovery, and you'll probably have to produce it. So it's not protected by any privilege as long as your attorney is not copied. And I'll deal with that in a minute. There are new penalties. There are a lot of changes in the law in recent years to try and toughen this up, toughen up this section, and provide more penalties for the destruction of official records. So if you, it's hard to prove, first of all, but if you deface or destroy an association official record with the intent, okay, this is the hard part. You have to prove the intent. The intent was to harm either the association itself or to harm a member of the association. You can be subject to a civil penalty by the Division of Condominiums. That penalty can be cease and desist order. It can be an order for restitution. It can be a fine. It can be a daily fine. It can be a fine of up to $5,000. So again, whenever you're talking about destroying official records, please talk to your attorney first before you go about doing that. In the age of digital communication, it's very easy to store records. It's not often a good idea to destroy records. And if you're thinking about destroying any official records, please talk to your attorney before you do that. The unit owner access to review and copy official records. This is used, unfortunately, as a weapon. If you have owners who are in a dispute, in a heated dispute with the association, you can anticipate that you are going to get a request to inspect your official records by that owner. And the system is subject to a lot of abuse in a lot of cases. But the larger picture is we want to be transparent with our owners. We want to provide them with access to the information, free access to the information. You as a board member should encourage your owners, if they have questions about documents with the official record with the association, you want to refer them and say, look, if you want to look at the accounting records, you can do so. Make an appointment and come in and look at them if you have questions. This is supposed to be a transparent process. The owners are supposed to have access to these records. And the rationale is simple. You, the association board, have a fiduciary duty over the money that is paid to the association and the financial interest of the owners. So the owners have the right to look at these records, and we've got to maintain them in a fashion such that they can look at them and get the information that they need. That should be our primary focus as board members. But there are abuses sometimes, and we'll talk about how to deal with those. The penalties for non-compliance, and this is where my litigator hat comes on again. If you do not provide access, I'll use the word access. We'll come back to this. If you don't provide access to those official records within 10 days of the written request, you can be subject to fines as an association. You can get fined $50 a day for up to 10 days, so $500 fine. The kicker is if an owner has to sue to get access to those official records, they can also get their attorney's fees paid for. So that's why this particular situation is used as a sword by a lot of owners who are upset with their associations. The key is access. And why do I say that? Under the law, the association does not have to go and pull specific records. If the owner says, well, I want to see the minutes for this meeting back in August of 2017. You don't necessarily have to go pull that record and provide it to them. You can, as an association under the law, provide, just email the records to the owner on their request. That avoids a lot of problems, but it is a little time intensive. Your manager is going to have to sit down with the records and go through and pull specific records. You do have the option of charging what's called a reasonable fee for doing that, but it's not clear. The statute doesn't provide clear guidance on what those reasonable fees are. But you can provide, what I was saying is you can provide those electronically, but really your obligation as an association is just provide access. So you can make an appointment with an owner within the 10 days, of course, to come in, and you can say, here's a flash drive. It's got all of our association records on it. You can look at it. Or, here are our banker's boxes full of the association records. You can look at that. And all you have to do as an association is provide them access so that they can, they have access to the records they're looking for. If they want copies, you can charge a reasonable fee. I believe under the condominium decisions, that's like 25 cents a page or something like that. Again, ask your association attorney for details on that, if you're going to charge any fees before you do that. But the bottom line is, if an owner asks for inspection of official records, make sure you're within the 10 days and make sure that you give them an opportunity to look at the records that they're looking for. You don't have to pull the specifics, but you do have to give them access to whatever files you keep, the files they're interested in looking at. There are some exclusions from the official records, and these are particularly important. See, I'm running a little short, but I'll try and go through these rather quickly. There are exclusions from what you keep in official records. The number one exclusion is attorney-client privileged information. What does that mean? Attorney-client privilege covers confidential communications between an attorney and their client that is made for the purposes of giving and receiving legal advice. So what I counsel a lot of my boards to do is, if you're discussing, for example, we were talking about board member to board member emails might not be official records, but emails that include the manager are official records. If we want to protect those conversations and the manager is involved, you should copy your attorney. Now, you shouldn't do this as a means to insulate your emails from inspection. But where there are conversations where you're seeking legal advice and the manager is involved, you should also copy your attorney, because then the records are covered by attorney-client privilege, and then they can't be produced in the official records. The important thing about this is you should keep those particular emails or opinion letters from your attorney, keep them segregated, keep them outside of where you normally keep all of your official records, so that you don't inadvertently produce something that's covered by attorney-client privilege, because that might get you in a situation where you're waiving attorney-client privilege, and we don't want to do that. So that's an important thing for your manager to take care of. Anything that's marked attorney-client privilege or involves a conversation with your attorney has got to be separated from your normal official records. There are other categories that are excluded from production. If your board approves sales or leases, all that communication is kept out of it. As I said before, personnel records, anything with your employees, for example, any memos that you have detailing their performance or letters back and forth to your employees about raises or anything like that. All those personnel records of employees of the association are not subject to production. Anything involving medical records, be very cautious about. They are protected and they're not considered part of your official records. And you might be wondering, well, why would our board have medical records of our owners? If you have emotional support animals, requests for emotional support animals, anything that might be a doctor's note to support that request, or other kinds of reasonable accommodations in your association, those things should not be produced as part of your official records. There's a long list of things, personal identifying information, of course, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, license plate numbers on cars, credit card numbers, emails, telephone addresses, emergency contact information, addresses for your owners. That sort of thing cannot be made part of the official records. The only part of that becomes part of the official records is the address at which the owner receives notices from the association. That is part of the association official record. If your association publishes a directory of owners and your owners have agreed to be in that directory, of course, that's an official record of the association. Other things that are excluded: computer security information for your association. That is not subject to production. Your owner can't come in and look at all your passwords. That's pretty common sense. The last thing I want to talk about real quick in my 3 remaining minutes, and then I'll try and
you do have several questions, Scott. So
Gotcha. Just briefly before we get to the questions, one thing I want to say is, if you do, one thing your board should consider is have an official process, a procedure for inspection of official records. Your association attorney can help you develop one. The statute allows your association to develop rules for how you address inspections, including frequency of how often an owner can inspect records during the month and that sort of thing. all that stuff should be reviewed with your association attorney, and you should come up with something that works for your association. Okay.
Okay. This one, what is a Q&A sheet?
The Q&A sheet is required to be produced pursuant to 718. Your manager will know about that. It's just one of those records that has to be part of your official records.
Okay. And this person also asked, must we video meetings and retain official records? And then someone else was asking that same question, but on the Zoom level.
If your association retains video of meetings and relies on them, then they have to be produced as official records. I have seen, typically I advise my clients not to videotape meetings and not to, keep recordings of Zoom calls and that sort of thing. But if they do, for whatever reason, if the association does, then it becomes an official record. If a manager, for example, just records meetings just to take notes to do the minutes and then destroys the recording afterward, that's not considered an official record.
Okay. The current roster for co-ops specifies email addresses. Are email addresses not part of official roster for the official records?
I don't believe you should you should produce the email as part of the roster unless the owner agrees to do so. I think that's the current thing.
Okay, and I think you answered this, but the question is, should board members use a specific email address from the association for all association businesses?
Not required, but I advise board members to do that.
Having name of condo in email address, even if it's personal, doesn't make it official, right? Make it official record.
I am not sure what that means.
I think what it means is what you said, like if you have your own personal email through Gmail, but you have the name of your.
Right. Got it.
Yeah.
Like it's Happy Trails Condo Association, Prez at Happy Trails Condo Association. That by itself does not make it an official record now.
Let's see. What about an email from a director to an HOA member? Is that public? Is that a public record?
From a board member's private computer to a member is typically not considered an official record. But again, if you get into litigation, it's something that will probably be subject to discovery. Okay.
And last question is, what is the proper document for an emotional support animal?
That is subject of another presentation. But like I say, if you receive a request for a reasonable accommodation from an owner, and typically that has to have a letter from a medical professional, that's a medical record. That should not be produced as part of the official record.
And I'm not sure I understand what this person is asking. Can the board vote over email or phone for requests like new windows, patios, etc.?
Is the person asking if those, well, you shouldn't be voting by email, but would those emails be considered official records? Is that their question? I'm not sure.
I don't know. I'm kind of reading it as maybe a new reserve, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that person means. So.
Yeah, wait, I see the question here. Can the board vote over email or phone? Typically votes have to be held at an open meeting. So that's beyond the scope of my presentation.
Yeah, I don't know what that person meant. So
it may be, if it's a board vote, boards can meet via telephone and, in that way, and they're not required to use proxies. So maybe the answer is yes, absolutely no over email. The statute's very clear. You cannot vote as a board over email, but a phone, if there's a board vote, you can vote verbally at an open meeting or a phone conference or even Zoom.
Sure, you could. Yeah, I think that's
Is that where it's getting maybe?
Yeah, if the question is, can your board at an open meeting phone in and vote? Sure. That vote will be recorded in the minutes, and that's an official record. But I'm kind of missing the point of that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure either. I hope we answered it as best they.
I gave it a shot. Talise gave me an assist, so.
Okay, and last question before we move on. Well, there's two. Is it allowed to send an email blast to all unit owners to be made aware of meetings, etc.? All emails would be on one notice sent.
Yeah, there's a process where you can opt into electronic communication.
Yeah, and do you need a specific form for owners to opt out of using email addresses as official records, or can it be a simple form that they check yes or no?
They have to opt into electronic communication. So it's not an opt-out process, but it's an opt-in. There's not an official form, but it can be put on a questionnaire sheet or something that you give like a new owner, that sort of thing.
Okay. One last one, and then we've got to move on. Is a board closed meeting for something they call urgent the same thing as an emergency? How do you price an emergency?
Well, I think the questioner is talking about two different things. A closed meeting can be held to discuss with your attorney to discuss pending or potential litigation, can be held to discuss personnel issues. Those they still have to be noticed, even though they're not open to owners, and the notices themselves will be part of the official record.
And she meant prove, and how do you prove an emergency?
There's no standards in the statute. The emergency thing just refers to the 48 hours required notice. Do you have to have post, or can you do it in an emergency? I mean, that's not defined by statute is the best way I can answer.
Okay, and we're out of time. So Scott, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And we're going to move on quickly with Mary on dispute resolution.
All right. Can you hear me all right, Karen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Last but not least, I'm Mary Hawk with Porges, Hamlin, Knowles & Hawk Law Firm. We've been in the Southwest Florida area for over 50 years. The firm has. I've been practicing for 24 years and with the firm for 18 of those. I practice in the community association law area. We have 3 partners, 1 associate, and several paralegals that work with community association law. Like Scott, I'm a litigator by trade, and I'm also a certified mediator and arbitrator, which is what we're going to be talking about today. I did want to answer, just because I recently fully more understood what cumulative voting is. Someone asked what it is. It means if you have five open spots for directors, they have to vote for up to 5. They can't give all 5 of their votes to one candidate and count as 5 votes for that candidate. So I don't think Talise had time to answer that question. But what we're going to talk about today is probably one of the worst parts of your job as a board member. And that's dealing with violations, dealing with people who are not following your rules, not following your covenants. And outside the scope of our talk today, though, is how you enforce your covenants, how you enforce your rules, how you get people to act right, do the things they're supposed to do. So I better turn off chat because it's really distracting me. All right, so you all probably have a process, hopefully have a process in your community for dealing with violations and how you're going to enforce your covenants. Usually the process is your manager sends a friendly letter, then maybe a not so friendly letter if they don't respond. Maybe if they're still not responding, not complying, you send it to your attorney. The attorney sends a letter. You might have a fining process set up. The finding process in condominiums and co-ops doesn't have much teeth in it. So, but that's a subject of an entire other class. It's how you do finding properly. You can vote to remove their rights to amenities, things like that that you're trying to do to enforce your governing documents, but they're still not complying. What do you do? So once you get to the point where nothing is working and someone is truly violating your documents, they've screened in their lanai improperly or without permission, or they have an unapproved tenant, or they painted their door chartreuse, whatever it is, and they won't rectify it. You get to a point with your attorney that attorney letters aren't doing anything, and you ask, well, what can we do now? So the law gives you a couple of options. You're required, instead of just hauling off and suing somebody, you're required to engage in what's called alternative dispute resolution. And those two main kinds of alternative dispute resolution are mediation and arbitration. And a lot of people don't understand that mediation and arbitration are two very different things. So mediation is an informal, it's voluntary, although the statute in some forms might force you to go. You don't have to settle your lawsuit at mediation. It's an informal, confidential process. There's a neutral third party who has no dog in the fight, called the mediator, and he or she facilitates discussions between the parties to try to have the parties come to a resolution of their dispute. The mediator doesn't have any decision-making powers. You don't prove anything to the mediator. The mediator doesn't say who's right and who's wrong. They just have a set of skills to try to help the two parties come together and settle their dispute. The goal for a mediation really is to leave with a written settlement agreement, in which case you have a written contract that's enforceable in court if the other party doesn't abide by it. And one thing they usually say is if you get a settlement agreement in mediation, you're going to be about 50% satisfied, because you're going to go in and you're going to compromise and you're going to come out with a settlement agreement. On the flip side is arbitration. Arbitration is much more akin to a lawsuit. It's a process where a neutral third party acts more like a judge, called the arbitrator. And the arbitrator does hear facts, consider the arguments and the evidence presented by the parties, and renders a decision as to who's right and who's wrong, who wins, who loses. It's just cheaper, faster, and more informal than a full-blown lawsuit. And arbitration can be either binding or non-binding. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what does this mean to you as a condominium or a co-op? Condominiums and cooperatives follow this same procedure. And I've got the statute sections listed for you in your materials if you want to read it. So certain condominium disputes, up until last July, you had no option but to go straight to arbitration. The law changed last summer so that now you have an option to either go to arbitration or mediation. You can't, again, you can't just go straight to a lawsuit. You have to do one of these two alternatives, either mediation or arbitration. Arbitration in your context for a condominium or a co-op is held in front of a Department of Business and Professional Regulation arbitrator. The arbitrator works for the DBPR's Division of Mobile Homes, Condominiums, and Timeshares. And they're very well versed, very well educated on condominium law. This is all they do. So you get your decisions pretty quickly. They know the law, may not agree with their decision, but it's, again, a cheaper, faster way to get a decision that is enforceable. So now the statute says you have this dispute, you've come to this branch in the road where you have to choose what to do. You can either mediate or arbitrate. There are a couple of kinds of disputes that are not eligible for mediation. Those are election disputes, if someone's disputing that you held your elections improperly, or if there's a recall dispute a group has, or your members have recalled board members and there's a dispute as to the recall process, that's basically your members have gotten together and fired a director. It's not an easy process, doesn't happen often, but it's called a recall, and those disputes aren't eligible for mediation. They go straight to arbitration or can be submitted to court. So if we have such a dispute, you've gone down all your enforcement roads and they're not complying, and you've said, okay, attorney for the association, we've got to do something legal. If you choose arbitration, it's non-binding arbitration with a DBPR arbitrator. What it means by non-binding is that the arbitrator does issue a ruling that is binding on both parties. Both the parties must conform their behavior to the order that the arbitrator gives. But you have the choice of saying, well, we're not happy with that. We're going to go to court and start all over again. So that's the non-binding part of it. The kinds of disputes that can go to arbitration are defined by the statute. Disputes that go to arbitration are generally disputes regarding the use of the unit. Again, somebody is, painted their door the wrong color, or their dog weighs too much, or, any of those things that happens regarding how they're using their unit, what their behavior is doing in violation of your documents. And it can be about a tenant's behavior too. A dispute that can go to arbitration is election and meeting notices. Someone says you didn't send your election notices correctly, not the outcome of the election, or that your board meeting notices aren't posted or sent correctly, or that you're a board that's meeting in violation of the law. Someone can bring an arbitration action against the association for that. One of your members can bring an action or an arbitration for the association's failure to maintain the common elements. It usually is the other way around. It's usually the association filing arbitrations against a tenant for not complying with their documents. However, there's a good amount of owners out there who know of this process and will file arbitrations against you, against the condominium association, alleging the condominium association or the board is doing something they're not supposed to do. By the way, this is when you run out and make sure you have officers and directors insurance, which I'm sure you all do. So if you've decided on the arbitration route, before you can file the arbitration, you must send a pre-arbitration letter, and it has to be very specific and contain some specific things that are outlined in the statute. So you would probably be best to have your attorney write the pre-arbitration letter. It's a demand for relief. It's a specific reasonable opportunity and deadline to comply. And you specifically have to say in the letter, if you don't comply, we're going to file an arbitration action with the DBPR. Again, this should be either reviewed by or sent by your attorney. The way the arbitration works is it's a $50 filing fee. It's been $50 for all 24 years that I've practiced, so they've never gone up, and that's considerably cheaper than filing a lawsuit. You file it with the DBPR in Tallahassee. They have yet joined the 21st century, so we still file things by fax and by mail with them. They are starting to send some orders and some things by email, but they don't yet have an electronic filing portal like the courts do, but we make do. If it's a tenant's behavior that's at issue, you have to include the tenant as a necessary party to the arbitration. You file it with the DBPR. You have to make sure it falls within the definition of a dispute, or else they'll kick it back. They'll say this isn't our jurisdiction. So the DBPR then receives the petition from you, and if they have a problem with it, they may send it back to you and say, no, you have to revise it, or no, this isn't our jurisdiction. But if they receive the petition and they feel it is within their jurisdiction, the DBPR then serves the petition on the respondent, meaning the person you're having your dispute with, and requires that person to file an answer. And then it proceeds like that, like a lawsuit, but again, much more informal and much faster. And a lot of it is done just on paper, you know, a complaint, an answer, maybe a motion for summary judgment, or there might be a telephone status conference held with all the parties on a telephone. Again, it's very informal. Sometimes people say, well, we have this dispute, we're going to file this injunction. I mean, we're going to file this arbitration action, but we really need some behavior to stop right away. It's an emergency. We need some behavior to stop and hold the status quo while we go through this arbitration process. If you genuinely need that, there is a way you can abate the arbitration and go to a court for a temporary injunction. Like if someone's about to, you know, cut down every tree in your common area space that's not theirs to cut down, you can go to court and get an injunction while you're at the same time filing an arbitration. Again, the arbitration proceeds. It might go to a final hearing, which is usually conducted by telephone. It might be disposed of by the arbitrator just on the paper, on the pleadings that are filed. And then the arbitrator makes their decision. So the party who prevails in that arbitration is entitled to have their attorney's fees reimbursed by the losing party. So if you lose, you may have to pay the other party's attorney's fees if they had an attorney, vice versa. If the association wins, you can have the owner pay the attorney's fees that you as an association incurred in bringing this arbitration. However, caveat, the arbitrators never, ever, ever award you all of your attorney's fees, nor do they award a reasonable hourly rate. They are all stuck back in the 80s, and they will award you some of your attorney's fees. But if you think you're going to be made whole, you're not. The party who does not prevail has 30 days to, you know, appeal. The appeal is not a traditional appeal. The appeal really is, we don't like this arbitration decision. We're going to go and file this same dispute all over again in court. And then that is called a de novo appeal. And it does actually start all over again in court. And the court will then award an order. And again, in court, whoever wins, the prevailing party can get their attorney's fees paid. So that's the arbitration process in a nutshell. If you choose mediation, and there are some disputes that may be better to go to mediation first. However, a lot of my association clients will say, well, they painted their door bright red and that's not allowed. What's there to mediate? We're not going to let them keep it that color. We're going to make them comply. So it may seem that there is no use for mediation in that respect. You might want to try it where you go to mediation and you say, we're not backing down. You have to repaint your door, but we're not going to charge you all of the attorney's fees we've incurred to get to this point. Not that you might be able to in the first place, but you may have some other leverage to use in a mediation where you don't give up the main thing. You know, you have to repaint your door, but maybe there's something else you can compromise on and get the person to agree to it. If it is truly something that's mediatable, then you follow the mediation process that's outlined in the Homeowners Association statutes, chapter 720, and I have the statute section reflected there. So what you have to do is you have to send a demand for mediation, and it's very, very detailed and spelled out in the statute what your demand for mediation has to contain. And I highly suggest your lawyer do that letter because it's really specific. The person that you demand mediation from has 20 days to reply. There's a way that they choose a mediator. The fee for the mediator is split 50-50, split between the parties, unless the parties agree otherwise. And many owners just refuse to mediate because of cost. If they refuse to mediate, or if they don't reply to your mediation demand, then you have fulfilled your obligation or the process of mediation at that point, and you can go either start an arbitration now, or you can go straight to court once the mediation process has been refused. If the recipient agrees to mediate, the mediation occurs. And the way a mediation happens, and they're mostly done by Zoom now, is the parties are really kept separated for 99.9%, if not 100% of the entire mediation. Sometimes if they're it's very contentious, you don't want them in the same room or even on the same screen. So the mediator will put you in different rooms, and the mediator hops back and forth and says, okay, well, this is how I understand it, and this is what they say, and this is what they're offering. It goes back and forth till hopefully you reach a settlement. If you reach a settlement, then again, you have a piece of paper, which is a court order which is an order that can be enforced in court. So it has some teeth to it. So the mediation settlement agreement is a much easier lawsuit for you to embark upon than the entire dispute being a lawsuit would have been. If you don't reach a settlement in court, then either party can sue in court or go to arbitration. Again, election and recall disputes are not eligible for the mediation process. So at the end, I've put just a little bit, some examples of arbitration decisions. A lot of people ask about, we're enforcing covenants now that were not previously enforced. You can begin to enforce existing covenants anew if there's a properly adopted and implemented uniform policy as to the existing restriction was not previously enforced, but it's going to be enforced going forward. If you wait too long after the dispute arises, after the behavior occurs, if you wait too long to go to arbitration, you may lose in arbitration. There's a case that says when more than 8 months passed from the time they sent the pre-arbitration letter to the time that they filed arbitration, that was too long, and they dismissed that arbitration. A lot of owners try to bring the management company in as a party to the arbitration. They're typically not a proper party. And a lot of your disputes, they don't fit into, they might be doing something that is against your rules, but there's not a specific rule about what they're doing, but it's wrong, and it probably is going to be encompassed by your nuisance provision. So take a look at your declaration and see if you have a nuisance provision. Just search for the word nuisance. Most declarations do. And a lot of the behavior that you might end up having to go to an arbitration or mediation about may be in violation of your nuisance provision if you can't fit it into another rule that you have, another covenant that you have. And just to leave you with this wonderful case from 2010, the arbitrator had entered a final order requiring the unit owner and the unit owner's child to comply with the governing documents. They were ordered to stop littering on the common elements, stop screaming in the unit, stop yelling at board members, stop allowing transients to stay in the unit, stop appearing nude in the common elements, stop having sex in the pool, stop digging up sod on the common elements, stop washing your pots and pans in the pool, leaving the association water on, maintaining unsanitary conditions in the unit, covering the windows with prohibited material. These are hopefully things you'll never have to deal with. However, we are dealing a lot more often with hoarders and things like that. But they can all be part of and encompassed in an arbitration where you can hopefully get the conduct rectified and complied with through the arbitration or the mediation process. I see Karen has reappeared. So do we have?
I've got a couple questions. A couple of them are, I think, for me about the recording today of this session. Yes, I will have our marketing person put the recording of this session up on our website, which is caiwestflorida.org. It'll be under the news and information tab, but it will be a few days before it is up. So that answers one question. And then well, I guess this was just a comment to someone else, but the next question is, can a cooperative create a code of ethics for their board members? And if it's violated, what would be the recourse?
Yes, there's a specific statute that says, now I know it's in the condo statute, and I'm 99% sure it's also in the co-op statute, that the legislature says you have the ability to pass rules of how you're a corporation and your board meetings are corporate board meetings, and you absolutely have the right to have a policy of how things are going to be conducted and how people will conduct themselves, including board members, at your meetings. I just had this at another one where your question was, what's the recourse? We had an off-duty police officer at the meeting and removed a person who did not conform their behavior to our code of conduct, which could apply to board members too. Someone had asked, I think it was during Scott's, about the 10 days. I know that if you're asking the 10 days for a records request, the statute says 10 working days. So we always go, it doesn't say business, it says 10 working days, but we always go by when the courthouse is closed as to what a working day is or is not. Do you recommend going to DVPR before seeking? Well, arbitration is in the DVPR. There is a more informal complaint process someone can engage in with the DVPR. There's an ombudsman who tries to settle disputes. I haven't seen very good results come from that. It's usually recommended, if you're at this point, to go seek the DVPR arbitration, because it is informal and it is cheap, cheaper than a lawsuit. And I would suggest going there first. There are, in Manatee and Sarasota, if you go to the Clerk of Court's website, there are free dispute resolution programs in both counties where you can go and have a free mediation. If both parties are willing to do it, you can go and have a free pre-suit mediation. And you can try that first because it's free. And if that doesn't work, then you can, think about the arbitration. But the DVPR complaint, informal processes, homeowners use those more. There's not really a whole lot of teeth in any kind of resolution you could get from them.
And I think that concludes our questions. Wait, we had one pop up. What is a typical time frame of a resolution of an arbitration petition after original dispute request date?
After you file the petition in arbitration, they move fairly quickly on them. A couple of months usually. So it depends on how great your dispute is. It depends on if you have, 19 counts in your complaint that require a lot of evidence. Of course, it's going to take a lot longer. But if it's one or two general complaints and it can be resolved on paper through affidavits or motions, they get on them pretty quickly, 1 or 2 or 3 months. The thing they're not quick about is awarding your attorney's fees, but is what it is.
Okay. And with that, it is 12:01. I want to thank all of you, Talise, Mary, David, and Scott, for your presentations today. I greatly appreciate it. This group always does anything I ask of them, presents anything I ask of them. So they are superstars, in my opinion. And thank you all for participating. Please give me a couple weeks to get the certificates out. It is our busy time of year. I am the one doing it. And we're right ahead of CA Day, which is March 24th at the Bradenton Convention Center. Please come out. Every one of these people will be at CA Day, and you'll get a lot of great information there. So with that being said, thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.
See you guys later.
All right, bye-bye.